Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. One summer afternoon when Dr. Martin Blosser was still a medical student, he went to see an 11-year-old boy who had suddenly become ill and was hospitalized. He was perfectly fine until 2 days earlier when he suddenly developed a fever and an upset stomach. The next day the fever worsened, and on the third day, the boy developed small purplish dots on his body. The emergency room doctors quickly realized that the boy had Rocky Mountain spotted fever, something caused by a bite from a tick infected with a type of bacteria called rickettsia. This bacteria multiplies within cells lining blood vessels, invoking an aggressive immune response. Since this involves the brain's blood vessels, it caused a form of encephalitis, a swelling of the brain provoking a massive headache. When Blosser accompanied doctors to see the boy, the room was darkened as the light hurt his eyes. His body was covered with purple spots, and he was thrashing around in his bed covered in sweat. He was yelling incoherently as loud as he could while hallucinating. As Dr. Blosser explains in his book Missing Microbes, the boy was started on an antibiotic called tetracycline, and after just 5 days, he was discharged from the hospital. Especially considering the gut microbiome is the big topic in health and science recently, you may know that not all microbes are bad. While there are pathogenic microbes like the ones just mentioned, at all times there are 500 to 1,000 different species of bacteria in the human body. And the importance of their function is becoming more apparent as we learn new things about them. However, it's hard to picture how tiny microbes in our gut contribute to our day-to-day cognition and brain function. In the case of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, it may not be surprising that the introduction of a deadly pathogen could induce drastic changes in a person's mental state. However, the relationship between the microbes normally residing in our gut and how our brain operates becomes apparent when we take them out. Scientists observing microbe-free mice living in sterile bubbles quickly notice that these mice have a personality that is distinct from mice with gut microbes. Microbe-free mice were found to be more prone to taking risks, and they freely explore their environment. Risk-taking might be good if you're a young entrepreneur, but the kind of risk these mice engage in is wandering out in an open field. For a mouse, this is an excellent strategy for quickly getting killed by a predator. Not only are the mice unusually reckless, scientists also noted that these microbe-free mice have memory-related defects. The book The Good Gut by Erica and Justin Sonnenberg describes how a group of researchers put normal and microbe-free mice through some memory tests. First, the mice were given 5 minutes to explore 2 new objects, a small smooth ring and a large checkered ring. Then the objects were removed for 20 minutes. After that, the large checkered ring and a new object, a star-shaped cookie cutter, were put in the cages. Predictably, the mice with the normal microbiota checked out the cookie cutter and paid less attention to the checkered ring because they already knew what it was. The microbiota-free mice explored the new cookie cutter, but spent just as much time checking out the old object, the checkered ring. It seemed that these mice had completely forgotten an object that they had just seen 20 minutes earlier. The forgetfulness in these mice may be explained by the fact that the microbe-free mice have lower levels of BDNF. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a powerful protein important for learning and memory. It stimulates the production of new brain cells and strengthens existing ones. Low levels of BDNF are linked to depression and anxiety. Since making microbe-free humans would be quite unethical, such experiments haven't been repeated in humans. But you may have heard of the woman who, after receiving a fecal microbiota transplant, became obese. The fecal microbiota transplant, or FMT, is just as it sounds. It's taking the poop from one healthy person and putting it into another person in order to share the healthy microbiota of the donor. FMT is not a common practice, but is the most effective treatment for a Clostridium difficile infection, which causes diarrhea and abdominal pain for weeks. In this case, the woman's donor was her 16-year-old overweight but otherwise healthy daughter. The transplant went smoothly and successfully cured the woman's issues. But over a period of 16 months, the woman gained 34 pounds. And this happened despite persistent diet and exercise efforts. She even went on a medically supervised liquid protein diet and still could not get the weight off. On the flip side of this, it's been found that putting the microbiota of lean mice into other mice protects them from gaining weight. So it looks like a microbiota transplant can transplant body types. But What about personality? In 2011, a research group at McMaster University did an experiment with two different types of lab mice. One type had a personality that was the mouse equivalent of anxious, and the other type was sociable and extroverted. To set a metric for how nervous the mice were, they put them on an elevated platform and recorded how long it took for them to step down. The mice with the anxious personality spent an average of 4.5 minutes slowly and carefully making their way off the platform. The extroverted mice jumped down in seconds. Then, the scientists switched the microbiota of the two types of mice and did the platform test again. The mice with the extroverted personality, after receiving the microbes of the anxious mice, now took over a minute to get off the platform. On the other hand, after getting the microbes from the extroverted mice, the anxious mice got off the platform a whole minute quicker. What this group showed was that in these mice, behavior and levels of anxiety were dependent on which microbes were living in their gut. One other thing, remember BDNF, the protein that we should like to have more of for better brain function? Well, the microbiota switch that made the anxious mice more confident also increased their levels of BDNF. The change in microbiota not only made observable changes in behavior, but in brain chemistry as well. In fact, there's all kinds of chemistry going on in the gut that can affect the brain. There's even research identifying which specific microbes produce which neurotransmitters. For example, it's estimated that 90% of our serotonin is produced in the gut, and it's been found that at least some of this serotonin is produced by these 4 microbes. These 2 microbes produce gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, our chief inhibitory neurotransmitter, which has relaxing and anti-anxiety effects. And these 2 produce our motivation neurotransmitter, dopamine. So we basically have this huge mass of little drug factories sitting in our gut, pumping out different substances that affect the brain. In fact, the gut and its microbes appear to affect the brain so much that preclinical research in rodents suggested that certain probiotics have antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects. Probiotics are basically substances you can take orally to stimulate the growth of certain microbes. One study found that a Bifidobacterium infantis probiotic had antidepressant effects on par with that of the antidepressant drug citalopram. I used to think that the only benefit of fiber was that it helped you poop. However, considering dietary fiber isn't food for us, but for our microbes, a diet rich in fiber from a variety of sources should also be good for our mental health. This information about the gut microbiome makes you start to wonder how many mental afflictions could be traced back to disruptions in gut health from, for example, diets rich in fiberless processed foods and refined carbohydrates, or from the unmitigated use of antibiotics. Antibiotics can be a lifesaver when absolutely necessary, as we saw at the start of the video. But the most commonly prescribed antibiotic, a wide-spectrum antibiotic, doesn't just kill the offending bacteria, but all kinds of other bacteria get caught in the crossfire. This is like poisoning your cat along with a bunch of cockroaches you're trying to kill. In the United States alone, tens of millions of people are prescribed antibiotics for minor afflictions. 60 to 80% of children taken to the doctor complaining of bad sore throats or ear pain will walk out with an antibiotic. It's estimated that people will take 30 courses of antibiotics by the age of 40. But the highest prescription rate was for children under the age of 2, with 1,365 courses per 1,000 babies. So, could all these antibiotics affect the young gut microbiome and the brain development of these children? A 2012 paper by Dr. Derek McFabe describes what happens when rats are injected with something called propionic acid, or PPA. The PPA injection provoked peculiar changes in the rat's brains like neuroinflammation, increased oxidative stress, and glutathione depletion. The rats also displayed abnormal movements, repetitive interests, cognitive deficits, and impaired social interactions. Basically, the results of this injection were very similar to autism spectrum disorders. And PPA is a fermentation product of bacteria, namely Desulfovibrio, Bacteroidetes, and Clostridia. It was found that patients with autism have many more species of the Clostridium bacteria and have high levels of PPA in their feces. It's estimated that in 1/3 of patients, autism doesn't show up until around age 18 to 24 months. Several reports from parents say that their children were developing normally until they received antibiotics for upper respiratory or ear infections. According to Dr. Sidney Feingold, antibiotics wipe out or suppress several organisms in the gut, but Clostridia is one of the ones that persists. A CBC program titled The Autism Enigma features Ellen Bolte, who explains how her son Andrew's behavior changed drastically after 6 courses of antibiotics over a 2 to 3.5 month period for an ear infection. After this, he was diagnosed with severe autism. Digging into the research, Ellen came across information about the Clostridia bacteria, so she started searching for a doctor who would be willing to try an antibiotic called vancomycin on Andrew. Vancomycin is specifically designed to target the Clostridia bacteria. After she finally found a doctor who agreed to test her theory, they tried the antibiotic, and it had impressive effects.
The results were astounding. Within a matter of just a few weeks, he became calm. He was aware of his environment. He's putting puzzles together.
The antibiotic brought out improvements in Andrew that were transient but drastic. This case led to a pilot study with Dr. Feingold and a Dr. R. Sandler, who found that out of 10 autistic children treated with vancomycin, 8 of them had again transient but significant improvements. Now, jumping to conclusions about the cause of autism has not been helpful in the past, but this idea that autism could be the result of a disturbed gut is gathering more and more data. A disturbed gut ecosystem would also explain the very common gastrointestinal issues autistic children suffer. Some estimates say that as high as 70% of children with autism spectrum disorders also have gastrointestinal issues. Autism is just one of the disorders that can be linked to a disruption in gut health, and research on the gut microbiome is growing quickly. About 3,600 articles on this topic were published between 2010 and 2015. At this point, saying the gut microbiome is important to health is an understatement. Dr. Martin Blosser says that losing your entire microbiome outright would be nearly as bad as losing your kidneys or liver. Unlike the kidneys or liver, however, you can change the makeup of your microbiome with what you put in your mouth. I guess Hippocrates knew what he was talking about when he said all disease begins in the gut, and let food be thy medicine. This video was brought to you by Squarespace. If you want to make a professional grade website, whether it's an online store or a page for your art, the process is super easy with Squarespace. They provide an all-in-one platform with beautiful designer templates to choose from, and it all comes with award-winning 24-hour customer service. Domain setup is really easy, and you can even transfer in your third-party domains. There's no upgrades, nothing to install, and no patches ever. You can start your free trial at squarespace.com, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/WIL to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.